Good evening, lovely people, and welcome to the new Neil Oliver Show. Let me know if you can spot the difference on GBNews TV, online and on radio. My first guest this evening will be the newly minted MP for Rochdale and leader of the Workers' Party of Britain, George Galloway MP. He'll be joining me to talk about a lot of things: the election just passed, Gaza, US politics, everything in between. I'll then be joined by Batya Ungar Sargon, who is the Deputy Opinion Editor of Newsweek and the author of the forthcoming book, Bad News: How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy. I'll ask her exactly how we have got to where we are today. Plus, plenty of discussion with my most excellent panellist, the writer and commentator Tom Buick. But first, an update on the latest news. Words matter. The precise meaning of words matters most of all. And one by one, those meanings are being changed right under our noses. Not only are we being censored, not only are legislators here in the UK and around the world turning the screws on the freedom to speak, words themselves are being stolen, made meaningless or gelded. For most of my life, the word woman referred only and precisely to an adult female human being, a human being born female with a female body. Not anymore. Now anyone can be a woman, can insist on being described and known as a woman, can co-opt the rights and status of a woman, make free with places set aside for the privacy and safety of women. All of it regardless and in denial of physical, biological reality. Racist is another word made slippery by modern meddling. All the way back in 1963, half a lifetime ago, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said he wanted a world in which each individual was judged not by skin colour, but by the content of their character. A colour-blind world, if you will. Not anymore. Now it's a prerequisite to notice skin colour first and to judge character second, as often as not on the basis of that colour. Discrimination against white skin is not deemed racist, but is instead virtually a requirement of meeting the demands of equity, diversity and inclusivity. Equity, diversity, inclusivity, the stuff of word salads, along with other words and acronyms repeated by the powerful and meddlesome until rendered into meaningless, mind-numbing cant. Save our NHS, flatten the curve, build back better, narrow window of opportunity, ESG, DEI. Extremist means whatever the establishment says it means, so that anyone and everyone might be labelled extremist if they hold and voice opinions at odds with the ideology of the day. Right and left, words that used to be descriptive of political affiliation, terms everyone understood, have not changed their meaning. Rather, they've been rendered utterly meaningless. A Nazi is anyone who disagrees with today's agenda. So too a fascist. Nazi, fascist and extremist are interchangeable, one-size-fits-all labels ready to be flung in the face of anyone deemed to be speaking out of turn. Diversity and inclusivity were once upon a time innocuous terms. Now they come laden with implied threat, empowering those that use them with authority that may not be challenged for fear of attracting the aforementioned labels of Nazi, fascist and extremist. One by one, words are being stolen from us, or set aside for the exclusive use of those assuming authority over anyone they don't like, any dissenting voice. Even the word truth is all but gone. No longer absolute and inviolable, the straightforward truth. Now the truth belongs to the powerful and means whatever they say it means, and always with the flexibility to mean something else tomorrow, and then the next day. Truth, what used to be meant by truth, truth for those who are otherwise powerless, is now misinformation or disinformation or, best of all, malinformation, which is truth that doesn't fit, that isn't wanted by the powerful, inconvenient truth. Anti-Semitic used to be descriptive of someone who, by speech or deed, made clear he or she did not like people of the Jewish faith. Now its meaning has been altered until it is descriptive as well of anyone opposed to actions of the State of Israel, even anyone with questions to ask about the legitimacy of those actions. Jewish people opposed to the actions of the State of Israel are also liable to be labelled anti-Semitic. In this way has anti-Semitism been devalued to the point where its ancient power to discourage racism is all but gone. The word democracy is little more than the punchline to a joke. In the United States, in this year of a presidential election, politicians have learned to say that democracy itself is on the ballot, which is ironic given that the intention is to have one name on the ballot and one name only. Other names banned, the name of Donald J. Trump removed altogether. The word democracy has had its meaning turned inside out, upside down. To be democratic now is to ensure the delivery of power into the hands of the few and to hell with the wants of the many. Last week in the UK, the PM, Rishi Sunak, hurried back to London in the aftermath of a by-election in the English town of Rochdale. He stood at a podium outside number 10 and said the majority secured by George Galloway, leader of the Workers' Party and a legitimate candidate by any measure, was beyond alarming. He said change can only come through the peaceful, democratic process. Except we're left to infer when elections are won by candidates of which the establishment disapproves. In 2024, we are invited to accept that the settled will of the people must not trump the will of the establishment. On Thursday, in his State of the Union address, US President Joe Biden had a lot to say about democracy. In a pitch for more weapons and money for Ukraine, he invoked the memory of past presidents Roosevelt and Lincoln and the Civil War and said freedom and democracy were under attack at home and abroad. He said democracy must be defended, that the events of January the 6th added up to a dagger at the throat of US democracy. He called for respect for free and fair elections. All of that against the background of hundreds of billions of pounds and dollars of taxpayers' money already spent, I would say laundered through Ukraine, not to mention 500,000 Ukrainian dead and counting. So much talk of democracy in the US and overseas, while US puppet President Volodymyr Zelensky has silenced opposition in Ukraine, silenced the media, outlawed the Orthodox faith. The war in Ukraine is surely a proxy war, prosecuted by NATO and the US, not in defence of democracy, but for political and financial gain, in naked pursuit of power and influence. The US and the West have been dabbling and meddling in Ukraine for years, for heaven knows how long, and for reasons yet to be made explicit. But long before any Russian tanks rolled across the border in 2022. This week, we learned that retiring US diplomat and warmonger Victoria Nuland, architect of the coup that ousted the democratically elected president of Ukraine in 2014, setting in train murderous civil war, has had a street named after her in the country she did so much to devastate. So much for respect for free and fair elections. George Orwell, the author whose words are quoted now more than most, said political language is designed to make lies sound truthful and murder respectable, and to give an appearance of solidity to pure wind. He said the purpose of politicians was the defence of the indefensible, which brings us to the word genocide, a word with more explosive power than any ordnance dropped in 1945. Apparently coined in 1944 by Polish-born US jurist Raphael Lemkin in specific reference to the Nazi extermination of the Jewish people. The word genocide literally means the killing of a tribe. Last month, the International Court of Justice deemed as plausible, accusations by the government of South Africa that the State of Israel was perpetrating a genocide upon the captive Palestinian people of Gaza. And yet, despite that statement by no lesser court than the International Court of Justice, still the use of the word genocide in the context of what is being inflicted upon the people of Gaza, well over 100,000 civilians dead, wounded, lost and counting, remains controversial to say the least. To misquote others of Orwell's words, all people are equal, but some people are more equal than others. Words matter. Famine is a word often misused and misapplied, or at least misunderstood. It comes from a Latin word that means to bring the hunger. Think about that, to bring the hunger. Famine is most precisely used now to describe an absence of food that might be interpreted as the will of God perhaps, or an accident of nature caused by drought or by blighted crops. For some it recalls thoughts of the suffering of millions of Ethiopians in the 1980s. Others hear the word and think of Ireland in the 1840s. In neither case were people starving to death for want of available food. Ethiopia was riven by brutal civil war, and one side was withholding food from the other, man-made starvation as a weapon. In 19th century Ireland, the potato crop, upon which the poor depended, failed for years in a row on account of blight, right enough. But there was food all around. Meat and vegetables abounded, grown and raised in Irish fields, but instead of being given to the starving poor, it was loaded onto ships and exported. Man-made starvation once more. Back in Gaza right now, this moment, Gaza of the plausible genocide, people are starving to death, out of sight but not out of mind. There is food nearby, some at least, but the humanitarian aid that might preserve life, make life possible, is being denied to the people of Gaza, so that babies have no formula, nursing mothers have no water, children have no bread. President Biden talked this week about building a temporary pier for humanitarian aid deliveries. But what's the point, I ask, in delivering food for a few weeks of ceasefire while simultaneously unloading weapons in Israel for the moment the firing starts once more? All around the world, people are demanding an end to the war in Gaza. Millions march to call for a ceasefire at least and are labelled extremists. The marches described as hate marches. Hate's another word possessed or manipulated by the powerful. It's apparently up to the powerful to decide and to define what is hate, what is hateful, who is hateful. Hate speech, stirring up hatred. These are new crimes for the age of misinformation, disinformation, malinformation. New crimes for a time in which the truth is whatever the powerful say it is. Words matter. Here's the thing. If there is any truth at all in the notion that the pen is mightier than the sword, then words make the cutting edge of the blade. They are kept sharp by precise definition and use, but blunted into meaninglessness when redefined at the whim of the powerful, snatched out of the mouths of those who often have nothing more than words with which to make plain who they are and what they stand for. Words matter. Biden, so-called leader of the free world, calling for more war and the defence of democracy in a country where there is no democracy. One powerful word he did not utter once was Trump. Too powerful, perhaps. Biden said Putin is on the march, that Europe was at risk, that the whole world was at risk. One decrepit ghoul rousing a rabble of other ghouls. It was hard to watch, harder to listen to. Lies and more lies. The only words that matter now are those we hardly ever hear. The truth. Do you feel words are being taken from us, played with, tricked around?
Neil, I always relish coming on your show and listening to your monologues. They're a great piece of wordsmithing, of course, in their own right. And as you said in your monologue, words matter, but facts matter even more, in my view. We seem to have reached a point, haven't we, in our political discourse in this country, certainly in the United States and in others around the world, where what we're seeing is increasingly narrative and counter-narrative. I mean, you'll recall back in 2017, was it Kellyanne Conway, who at the time was the advisor to President Trump? She coined this term, alternative facts. And it seems to me we've never quite recovered from that period, that what we've got is politicians of all tribes, of all stripes, who essentially engage in a battle for the public's attention by coming up with the facts that suit their narrative, rather than having an open, honest and frank, truthful debate with us about what's really going on.
It's the words, though, for me, woman, racist, anti-Semitic, extremist. Not so very long ago, we all knew what those words meant.
Yeah.
But now they do seem to be, the definition seems to be in the hands of those that would use them against us.
Well, as George Orwell said famously in 1984, this is an example of newspeak, which leads to doublethink. And doublethink is the ability to hold two contradictory beliefs at the same time. And this is why I think for ordinary voters and citizens, they're so confused.
You've put your finger on it. The ability to hold more than one idea in the head at the same time is the essence.
It is. And we see this playing out in relation to gender criticism and all of that. Absolutely.
Much more from Tom to come. After the break, I'll be joined by the newly elected MP George Galloway for the first part of a no-holds-barred, in-depth interview which will give us a more complete understanding of the man You're watching The Neil Oliver Show on GB News. Don't go away. Welcome back to The Neil Oliver Show. Now, George Galloway has just begun work once more as a Member of Parliament. I think it's either the 7th time or the 8th time. He brings 50 years of experience, and he's already said that he wants to oust Labour's Deputy Leader from Parliament. He was sworn in as an MP following his by-election win in Rochdale last week. George joins me now. Lovely to see you, sir.
And you could call me MP again after a brief interlude of 9 years.
You just keep coming back and back, Mr. Galloway.
Than Frank Sinatra.
Fair to say you've put the wind up Westminster by your return.
Yes, and it's a joy to behold not just Westminster, but their coterie, their echo chamber in the legacy media have temporarily, one hopes, lost their minds. The Prime Minister erected a lectern and a presumably big platform outside 10 Downing Street at the state's expense for an entirely party political broadcast to which there was no reply, not even at Prime Minister's questions, where I failed to catch the Speaker's eye. And I no longer open the Google alerts of right-wing commentators, many of them on your very channel, literally spewing hate speech at me, over me, about me. I'm not sure what I did to deserve it, but hey, it's a question of dogs barking and the caravan moving on.
How do you feel about that reaction? You know, I said at the top that, you know, you're long in the tooth when it comes to being in Westminster, being in that febrile environment. But after all of this time, with all of your experience, to be confronted with that kind of reaction, a Prime Minister saying that it was beyond alarming as a threat to democracy that a legitimate candidate had won a by-election. What was your gut reaction to that?
Well, you know, I've often been Daniel in the lion's den, dare to be a Daniel, dare to stand alone. Used to be one of my hero, Mr. Ben's favourite rhymes. And so I don't mind it. I'm only perplexed when it comes from unexpected quarters, as in GBNews terms it has. But the expected, usual suspects, I relish their angst. I'm an experienced short sword fighter, as you said, for more than 50 years in politics. So, you know, I'm well able to handle it. The facts are chiels that win a ding, as our bard said. Facts can't be changed. Not only did I win a crushing victory over all three big parties of the state, but they didn't even come in second, a point which they all tried to erase. Between me and a totally unknown independent, unknown outside Rochdale, we got almost 2/3 of the votes, leaving the big three, big four parties of the state to share the other third. This is a crushing rejection of the Uni Party, the two cheeks of the same backside, who all got a big spanking on Thursday night past.
What does it tell us about where we are now with politics in Britain, with democracy in Britain? As you say, the big two, the Conservatives and Labour, you know, beaten back by yourself and a hitherto unknown independent. What is the nature of the parlous state of politics in this country?
Well, nobody loves them. That much could not be denied even by their mothers. Nobody loves Labour or the Conservatives, Sunak or Starmer, quite possibly not even their mothers. And that's the first thing you have to chalk up as an uncontested fact. People still move for them, but only out of interest, not out of love. And when the public have a chance to vote for someone who can credibly defeat them, then they take that opportunity. And I think that this was the straw that broke the camel's back in Rochdale. The spread of candidates, challenges, new parties, independent candidates, and so on, is now proceeding like wildfire. If I tell you that I have now in my pocket more than 300 prospective parliamentary candidates, all paying their own election expenses, by the way, because we can't pay them, more than 300 Workers' Party parliamentary candidates. Imagine that. We didn't have 4 weeks ago. Now we've got more than 300. And then when you add in the independents that are popping up, growing like topsy across the country, we are talking about a challenge to the legacy parties in practically every constituency in the land, certainly many hundreds of them. And thus the course of the next general election is radically altered. We'll either win seats or we'll stop Keir Starmer from winning them. Thus, the outcome of the general election is dramatically altered, and all bets are off. So when I saw, for example, your own Jacob Rees-Mogg of your parish making a tear-stained plea on GBNews for people not to abandon the Labour Party, how much the country needs the Labour Party, I scratch my head in utter bewilderment, I must tell you.
Bear with me, George. Tom Buick, do you scratch your head in bewilderment? What do you make of the changes that are indicated, that are evidenced by Mr. Galloway's success in Rochdale, and, as he says, the possibility now of an alternative to the two cheeks of the same backside?
Like a lot of ordinary voters, I'm scratching my head at just the degree of polarisation now that exists in our society. And yes, Labour and the Conservative Party need to take some responsibility for that kind of climate. But at the end of the day, we've also seen now elected to our mother of all parliaments, politicians who, depending on your point of view, I mean, George Galloway won the election, congratulations, but to some people he's a demagogue, and the definition of a demagogue is someone who appeals to prejudice rather than rational argument. So my retort back to George Galloway is, in terms of his politics going forward, is he going to be a unifier, or is he going to continue to be a divisive force in British politics?
George, do you see yourself, what is your reaction to being marked as a divisive figure in British politics?
Well, I don't know who your guest is. I've never heard of him before, and I shan't stoop to answer his smear. I was elected in a democratic election with a thumping majority, in which the two big parties of the state came third and fifth. So I don't have to answer to any unknown guest of yours. And I've got news for him. Politics was divisive from the moment that democracy existed. You decide to support this war or oppose this war. That's a division. Somebody has to speak for both sides of that division. I was kicked out of the Labour Party for being a leader of the movement against the war on Iraq. No doubt your guest and others would have said my opposition to the Iraq war was divisive. But I turned out to be right. The people pushing for the war turned out to be wrong, now even by their own admission. And unfortunately, 1 million people lie dead, and extremism cascading around the world as a result of my failure to persuade enough people to oppose that war.
George Galloway, George Galloway, if you let me just interrupt there, I have to go to a break at the moment, but I think we can all see that George Galloway MP is back in the ring. After the break, I'll be continuing my discussion with George Galloway MP. Don't go away. Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. Now, I'm lucky enough this week to have a double time with my guest, George Galloway, MP. So let's turn our attention to the situation in the Middle East conflict. Hello again, George. Now, you said that what happened in Rochdale, your attention on Rochdale was for Gaza. Can you tell me what you mean and meant by that?
Well, the people who oppose the murderous war in Gaza, which has reached the stage that the highest court in the world has said that it can plausibly be described as a genocide, pretty strong and heavy charge, which the highest court in the world has sent Israel for trial on, is so horrific to so many millions of people in this country and indeed around the world, that it is a wonder that they are locked out of media and parliamentary opinion. No one speaks for the people out on the streets from Land's End to John O'Groats every other Saturday and midweeks and rain, hail, snow. Nobody speaks for them in Parliament. They don't get a look in the legacy media. On the television, if they are interviewed, as you're interviewing me now, they're called divisive or demagogic because they want to stop children being killed, slaughtered every day and night of the last 150 days. So there's something of a conspiracy against the voices for peace, for ceasefire, for withdrawal from this war. And then a by-election came along. And what better place to fight, to break the silence, to break the mold, than a parliamentary by-election where, in the Greater Manchester region alone, of which Rochdale is a part, there are the best part of 1.5 million or 2 million people who oppose this war, based on my extrapolation from national opinion polling, attendance at protests, and so on. So it became a Greater Manchester cause célèbre, and people flooded in from all over the region. They worked day and night, vast majority of them white English people, by the way, who knocked on every door in the constituency, and the rest is history. We beat the legacy political parties out the park.
George, but for Gaza, but for events in Gaza, would you even have contemplated a return to Westminster?
I probably would have in Rochdale. I knew the deceased Member of Parliament very well for 40 years. I knew the town of Rochdale very well, as I've been speaking in it regularly for 25 years. My daughter was born nearby. 2 of my sons live nearby. And for my sins, I attend Old Trafford in Manchester every other week. So I'm deeply immersed in this part of the world. So I probably would. I probably wouldn't have if the by-election had been in, I don't know, the home counties somewhere. But in Rochdale, in the northwest, in Greater Manchester, where I already knew I had a lot of support, yes, I probably would.
George, Tom, someone does have to speak up for Gaza and the Gazans. You know, you use the word demagogue, you use the word divisive, but surely it is true to say that with 30,000 dead, 100,000 people in total dead or wounded or lost in the rubble, someone is right to speak up for Gaza.
And I accept George Galloway can speak up for whoever he likes. He's now an elected Member of Parliament. But with that comes a lot of responsibility. It comes, for example, not just for the constituents of Rochdale, but in terms of taking part in our national debate, that we don't further tensions, sectarianism, or indeed promote the idea that we should be even electing factions based on religious grounds to Parliament.
How about that, George? You and I think we would both concede that the Britain that you and I grew up in has radically changed in a very brief space of time. I think it's been more changed and changed more quickly than perhaps any other country, possibly ever. Do you understand, sympathise with the anxieties, the angers, the despair that's there in many communities around the country in the face of change?
That much is undoubtedly true, but I really must deal with this divisive issue. You can't sit on the fence on the plausible genocide in Gaza. You're either for it or you're against it. If you're against it, you must speak against it. You must march against it. You must protest about it. And you must call out the people proselytizing for it. Now, if that is divisive, well, what else can one do? Can we try and find a cozy consensus? Maybe we'll kill just people over the age of 45. Maybe we'll only starve those who are already overweight. I mean, what's the consensus, the non-divisive approach to this? Children are being killed. I'm against it. I spoke out against it. The people endorsed my stance. And that's really all there is to it. I have no responsibility to your guest to keep my criticism of a genocide within bounds that please him, even if I were able to divine what those bounds might be. But yes, there's always been division in politics, Neil. I was active in my first general election at the age of 10 in 1964, when Mr. Wilson savaged the 13th Earl of Hume, who was the Conservative Prime Minister at the time, and broke the apparently never-ending rule of the upper-class Conservative patricians. It was a divisive time. The 60s were divisive. The 70s, even more divisive. And they didn't require me in Parliament to be divisive. I've done an oral book on the 1970s. The 70s was the most extraordinary decade in modern times that our country has ever gone through. So, look, politics is divisive. Do you go this way or do you go that way? And let the schools of thought contend and let the people choose between them. That's my view.
George Galloway, MP, we will all look forward with a great deal of fascination to see how your latest tenure in Westminster will play out. Thank you so much for your time this evening.
Welcome.
Next, I'll be joined by Batya Ungar-Sargon, the Deputy Opinion Editor of Newsweek and the author of a forthcoming book, Bad News: How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy. She'll talk about why we have got to where we are and how. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. Join me next is Batya Ungar-Sargon, opinion editor of Newsweek. She has also been the opinion editor of Forward, the largest Jewish media outlet in America. She has written about how woke media is undermining democracy and also about how the elites have betrayed America's working men and women. Batya joins me now. Good evening. How are you?
Thank you so much for having me. This is really a pleasure and an honor to be here with you.
Oh, thank you. Now, you've spoken and written about the abandonment of the working people of the United States of America by the political establishment. Can you develop that thought for us?
Yes, absolutely. And I think it echoes with a lot of the themes that you talk about a lot. You know, it used to be that the Democrats in our country represented the working class and the Republicans were the party of the rich and corporations and tax cuts and free trade. And what happened was the Democrats abandoned the working class to cater to what I call the over-credentialed college elites, people who get degrees and work in the knowledge industry. And And unfortunately, the number one thing they pick up at their universities is to have contempt for people who work with their hands for a living, who work in goods and services, who do the kinds of jobs that we all rely on to survive. And so then what you had was one party that represented the rich, which was the Republicans, and one party that represented the elites, the credentialed elites, which was the Democrats. And that's how sort of Trump showed up and was able to really speak directly to the working class, the multiracial working class in this country, and say to them, look, neither party has a model that's working for you. The Republicans believe in this trickle-down nonsense. The Democrats basically want to cater to the elites and then have large taxes to fund a welfare state from the bottom to sustain the poor. But neither of those models is what the working class wants, which is what they want is an economy that rewards their hard work, because they work really hard, and no one was really offering that.
Do the Democrats, do they even understand why Donald Trump appeals? Has that penetrated yet, why his message is so effective for his audience?
It hasn't. And what we're seeing right now is an absolute reprisal of the kind of language we heard in 2016 when Donald Trump started to rise. And you had Hillary Clinton talking about this basket of deplorables, which was how she called the working class that was flocking to Donald Trump. Now you have this new book, White Rural Rage. They have invented this idea that the working class is racist and xenophobic in order to absolve themselves of the responsibility for having abandoned these people. And they say that they are racist because they want a national border and a trade agreement that protects their labor. This is now called racist by the elites, who, of course, are never threatened by trade, are never threatened by immigrants, because they work in the knowledge industry. You need a command of the language in order to do that. You can't be threatened by somebody who doesn't speak English. Whereas when you're working class, those people are coming and they are competing in your industry. And we've seen how it has driven down working class wages.
If the Democrats are going to treat working people with contempt, just cast them aside into a basket of deplorables, what on earth do they think the consequences of that will be? What does it mean for democracy if the Democrat Party doesn't seem to feel as though it needs the people?
Isn't that ironic? And they took it one step further. They literally tried to get Donald Trump off the ballot in multiple states. Can you imagine this? The side that calls itself the defenders of democracy literally trying to get the most popular politician in the country off of the ballot. There's just so much projection going on. And unfortunately, like we said, in these elite universities, they really imbue the students with this feeling that if you don't have that credential, if you don't have that education, they don't really learn very much, you really don't deserve the franchise. They really believe that somehow, if you don't agree with them on their chosen policies, you're not just wrong, but you are evil and a threat and dangerous, and you must be silenced and stopped.
But it sounds as though the Republicans also are at least partly inhabiting that same dysfunctional bubble. That political class seems to have divorced itself from the people almost in their entirety. How do they function as meaningful parties of people?
You're exactly right. What looks like a political divide in America is actually a class divide separating out the elites in politics, like you said, the elites in the media on both sides from the people. And the thing I try to explain to liberals, because they really don't understand it, is that the working class that votes for Trump, there's one thing they hate more in America than the Democrats, and it's the Republican Party. These are conservatives, and they hate the Republican Party because they feel that the Republican Party has sort of pimped them out and sold them out because they agree with them on social issues more than they agree with the Democrats. And so the Republicans say, okay, you know what, we can sell out your future on an economic platform because you'll never vote for the Democrats, so we have you hostage. And they really hate that.
Tom Buick, this sounds so familiar on our side of the Atlantic, doesn't it? That way in which the political class, if they are a class, have almost consciously cut themselves away from the people they're supposed to represent. Just do as I say and not as I do.
Absolutely, because when you look at the legislatures on both sides of the pond, they're both the credentialised class, and they've obviously come up on a tide of mass higher education on both sides of the Atlantic. That in itself is not necessarily the issue. I mean, what I find refreshing actually about our guest here is she's talking about how social class is still one of the biggest divides that holds people back in our society. So I think both parties, particularly the Democratic Party in the US, needs to start attaching itself again back to that narrative in order to win over these voters that have gone over to Trump.
Batya, what do you see lying ahead? If democracy in the United States, as indeed here in the UK, is in such a parlous state, what, when you look in the crystal ball, do you see unfolding in the months ahead? Well, of course, with a presidential election at the end of the year.
Well, I actually feel really happy about the state of our democracy, because if you think about it, in the GOP primary, in the Republican primary, Donald Trump was outspent 2-1 by every single one of his opponents, and he still managed to win. So the electorate, by sheer force of showing up, was able to beat him. And then you look at what he's had to face from the Democratic side, the lawfare, the smears, the impeachments, and he's still managing to outperform Joe Biden in the polls. So I feel really good about the state of our democracy, because it does seem to me like the electorate is having its say, despite the billions and billions of dollars and institutional power that's been thrown at silencing them.
The electorate having their say. What a rebellious thought. Batya Ungar Sargon, thank you for joining us this evening. I hope we can pick up this conversation again in the future. You're watching the Neil Oliver Show on GB News, and that is it for the hour on TV. So stay tuned for Free Speech Nation. But if you're watching online, stay tuned for our second hour, featuring more from George Galloway MP, plus Seb Gorka and Colonel Douglas McGregor. Good evening and welcome to the Neil Oliver Show. I have to say, it's a pleasure to be able to announce that for the first time in a long time, I have a second hour. It's what I've wanted for the longest time. It's the chance that it affords to get away from sound bites and to really let my guests talk. And I know my audience is well informed. I've had enough time to get to know the people watching and listening to this content. And I know that you want depth and that you want nuance, because you know more than the basics of what's going on. And I know that you're ravenous, that you have a ravenous appetite for more detail, and that's what I hope to be able to do here. Also, I really cannot stress this enough. If you out there have people that you want to hear from, potential guests, faces and voices that you think the wider world should hear and know more about, then let me know. Just let me know. OK, now the newly elected MP and leader of the Workers' Party of Britain, George Galloway, is on the comeback. He'll be discussing what it's like to be back in Parliament after all these years. We'll be hearing from Seb Gorka, former Deputy Assistant to President Donald Trump, and he'll tell us what he expects to happen in the American elections this year. And I will then be joined by retired US Army Colonel, government official, author, consultant and political commentator Douglas McGregor to ask if voters in the US and elsewhere have faith anymore in the election process. All of that in the company of my panellist, the wonderful broadcaster and commentator and friend Tom Buick. Now, let's start the hour by hearing more from George Galloway MP. I have to keep reminding myself to revert to that title of old, George Galloway MP. I want to find out how he feels to be back in Westminster after all these years away. George, what do you have in mind for the people of Rochdale? You know, after all, that is really what the job is all about.
Well, first of all, I'm delighted that you've got your second hour. You're a master of the art, and no one deserves a longer form than you. And I hope to be with you many times. I've spent this day trying to save Rochdale Football Club, which is a part of the heart of the town, which is about the only quarter of the heart that is left. We're a town where you can't be born. The maternity facilities were taken from us without a whimper of protest from Labour, which is the commanding political force in the area. Even you can't die in Rochdale. The A&E has been taken away also. You can't even be banged up in a cell in Rochdale. You'll, in all three cases, be taken to an undetermined, until you get there, facility in somebody else's town, somebody else's city. And if we lose the football team on top of these losses, then to what extent will we still be a town? So I've spent this day following events closely, seeking to put ducks in a row to save the football team. And I hope very much that we can do that. Yesterday I spent trying to hurry along the reopening of the open-air market, another of the parts of the heart of the town that have been transplanted. The only town around Manchester that breathes on its own is Bury, and one of the reasons why, the main reason why actually, is that they have a world-famous open-air market. I hope that that will be open by the spring, this spring, and that will be a solid achievement. If we can help save the football team, another solid achievement. The reopening of the town hall, refurbished at a cost of £20 million, thanks to the National Heritage Funds. And by the way, a lot of Peaky Blinders scenes were filmed in there, all the parliamentary scenes. It's a thing of beauty, a joy forever. And it's all, I hope, part of the Rochdale revival. And I hope to be a significant force in the Rochdale revival. I say, make Rochdale great again. What's wrong with that slogan? It was once great, now it isn't. It can be great again.
George, it's said that we get the governments that we deserve. To what extent would you say that we, the people of Britain, the inheritors of a prouder past, to what extent are we the people to blame for what we have occupying the green benches of Westminster and the House of Commons?
Well, partly, but not wholly, because there's a whole industry of distortion that is deployed to parade the voters down the pathway of the prevailing orthodoxy. People are called mad or bad or divisive or demagogic if they pursue policies, advocate solutions that lie outside the parameters that are laid down for us by our betters. And that confuses a lot of people. But the good news is that the number of people who are conscious of what's happening, what's happened, what needs to happen, is greater in Britain today than it has ever been. And I should know, I've been 50 years and more in active political life. So I can measure through social media in particular the dramatic growth of consciousness, of a proper understanding of who's who and what's what. And that takes time, but that will find its impact in the political process. In a way, we have a parliament that is the product of the manufactured consent to these narrow parameters that the legacy media and the legacy parties have led us down. But that is beginning to change. I'm confident about that.
To what extent, George Galloway, do you feel that the people, the population of Britain, see the real George Galloway? And to what extent do you think they're just presented with a caricature that suits the agenda of the relic media?
Well, I've been reminded all over again in the last few days, the hailstorm that the media can produce to reduce visibility of the true facts. I mean, I've taken multiple action over the last day or two against wholly fake, fraudulent news. For example, the Daily Telegraph said that 80% of the votes cast in the by-election were postal votes. In fact, it was 40%, half of what the Daily Telegraph claimed. And the clear implication, of course, was that these 80% postal votes were somehow fraudulent. So there's a hailstorm going on. But even through the hail, people can see, particularly on social media, all my metrics are through the roof. And now that you're back partly online, Neil, metrics are important. My following on social media has risen to many millions. The views on my mother of all talk shows on all social media platforms are at an all-time high. 3 million people will have seen last Sunday's show and another 3 million last Wednesday's show. These are numbers that no one else can match. And so people vote with their feet, with their fingers, to get more knowledge, to get more visibility. And thanks to the technological revolution, they can now access what I believe to be the truth, but which they may merely be seeking a different side of the story. And as long as they do that, I'm satisfied.
George Galloway, I, for one, very much look forward to the return of a gadfly to the Palace of Westminster, and at the very least, I will look forward to seeing just how much of a wind you do succeed in putting up them. Thank you very much for joining me so far. Another break is upon us, after which I will be joined by the one and only Seb Gorka, former Deputy Assistant to Mr. Donald J. Trump, to talk about what we can expect from the upcoming American presidential elections. You're watching The Neil Oliver Show on GB News. Don't go away. Welcome back once more to The Neil Oliver Show. Super Tuesday has come and gone. Was it super this year? There were some predictable results, but also a few surprises, perhaps some warning signs for both Donald Trump and Joe Biden ahead of their expected rematch in November. My next guest is former assistant to Mr. Trump, Sebastian Gorka. He joins me now to unpick the polls. Good evening, Seb Gorka.
Greetings to you. It's been far too long. Hello.
It's good to have you. Joe Biden invoked your old boss 13 times, I believe, in his State of Union address, but never actually mentioned his name. What, if anything, is to be read from that tactic?
Well, he's a coward, and he also is caving. The whole campaign is cratering his presidency. The State of the Union is a very solemn, or should be a very solemn act, required by our constitutional order for the incumbent president every year to address both houses and talk about what has happened in the last year and what his plans as president are for the following year. It's not supposed to be a stump speech from the hustings. And that was an angry old man giving a campaign speech full of lies and deflections and treating President Trump like Voldemort, whose name must not be mentioned. It was pathetic.
How much will it have been affected relatively last minute by Super Tuesday? How much would that have influenced the script writers when it came to putting together what they felt the leader of the free world should be heard to say?
Well, it's Super Tuesday, the historic wins for President Trump all over the country in 14 different states of the union. But on top of that, the thing that I think was most irritating and why you saw this grumpy old man yelling for an hour is the polls. Even the New York Times, which is a bastion of left-wing propaganda and really a propaganda arm for the Democrat Party, their latest poll this week says that if the election were today, my former boss, would handsomely defeat the current incumbent. So, yeah, I mean, he was rattled because he knows the American people want peace and prosperity back. They want a secure border. They don't want wars in the Middle East. They don't want wars in Europe. They don't want, petroleum costing 3 times what it did when we were in the White House. And they know that they have nothing to offer except a screeching, senile old man.
Tom Buick, what have you made of those recent events, Super Tuesday and then the State of the Union address? How are you reading what's unfolding for democracy on the other side of the Atlantic?
Well, it's clear we're going to get a rerun, aren't we, of 2016, but on steroids in terms of the division and the polarisation in American politics. But I think, as Seb's saying, yes, people do want an end to these wars in the Middle East and in Ukraine. But we shouldn't be for a moment entertaining the idea that somehow the United States and the West have caused these conflicts. I mean, Putin is a dictator. He has invaded sovereign territory. That's what this vote in Congress is all about, to try and ensure that with our ally in Ukraine, we support them at this time. The same in Gaza.
But the story...
7th of October was a prescribed terrorist organisation, Neil, that invaded sovereign territory and beheaded babies and raped young women.
The story of beheaded babies has been absolutely walked back. That is a falsehood that still keeps coming around like a bad penny. But what is the West doing? What is the West doing in Ukraine? What is the West doing in the Middle East? And the backstory to Ukraine is a lot more complicated than just Russian tanks crossing the border.
Of course it's more complicated. But you're a student of history, just as I am, and I know Seb will be as well. But the lesson, and we're going to celebrate, aren't we, and commemorate the 80th anniversary of the D-Day landings this year. As the President of the United States said last night, if the West doesn't stand up for freedom and democracy around the world, then who will? And frankly, the barbarians are already at the gates, whether that's Hamas or whether that is dictators like Putin who are threatening not just our own security, but the whole of the global international order.
Seb Gorka, isn't there an argument to be made for the world wanting peace now rather than these endless forever wars? Is the rising tide from the populace in countries around the world not that we've had enough of this push for endless war?
Yeah, but that doesn't mean anything. I mean, to quote Trotsky, you may not be interested in a war, but war's interested in you. You can't just say, "Ooh, I don't like it. I'm going to say la, 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 and I don't want war." And to the point about what happened in Israel, I strongly commend, and Neil, please don't, just say that's all a conspiracy theory. I've seen the unedited videos of what Hamas did, and it's horrific. The charred babies. You may not have live video of them being burnt, but I've seen the aftermath. I've seen a father being beheaded with a garden hoe as the Hamas resistance, quote unquote, were laughing. I've seen young IDF women hiding under a desk being shot to death as the Hamas resistance fighters, quote unquote, are chuckling to themselves. So, it is absolutely horrific and should be dealt with as such. But to your point, we need leadership back in the White House. Why was it? It's so fascinating that for 4 years there were no new wars. Putin didn't do anything. The Middle East was stable. We had the Abraham Accords with 5 different nations because people respected America and feared my boss. When Biden came in, he surrendered Afghanistan. Putin revved his guys right into Ukraine, and then Hamas kills more Jews since the Holocaust. I mean, this is the reality. Everybody laughs at this man, and we need, I agree, no more wars, but the only way to get that is to get President Trump back in the White House.
Isn't it right, though, to acknowledge that atrocity is atrocity? That everything that has happened in the Middle East these months past, everything from October the 7th, and then what is happening in Gaza, isn't it possible to be offended by both and to say that with 100,000 casualties in Gaza, 30,000 dead and the rest wounded, missing, that enough is enough?
No, because that's not how wars end. You don't say, "I don't like it." I mean, how did World War II work out? We didn't say proportionality, and we're only going to kill as many Germans as they killed Brits. No, we didn't say, oops, we don't like war, can you end it? No, we absolutely destroyed Germany and we nuked Japan. This idea of proportionality is asinine. When you're killing children and raping women after you killed them, then you must salt the earth with the ashes of those who did it. And there will be collateral damage because that's the nation of war since man first picked up a rock and hit his enemy in the head with it. So we need to be realistic. War is the history of mankind, and we need people who will prevent it by being determined in the protection of their nation. And Israel has every right to make sure this never happens again to them.
With no limits on what happens. You know, the
International
Court of Justice has said plausible case to be made for genocide in Gaza. Now, surely when genocide is being invoked, surely enough is enough.
That organization is a tool of the globalists. The International Criminal Court. Are you kidding me? And the statistics from the Hamas Ministry of Health, come on. These are the guys who actually put rocket launchers in hospitals. These are the people who hide their armories in the schools of Gaza. And we're supposed to trust those figures? No, let's be realistic. We want the fighting to stop. President Trump wants it to stop, but it's not going to stop by wishing it to stop or by calling one side genocidal when they have more lawyers preventing them from doing what they could do than any other army in the world. And I mean the IDF. I know the IDF very well, and they are very, very circumspect about international laws of war, unlike the people who they're fighting, who think children are a target that is absolutely justified.
Clearly, there is no sign of the heat going out of this febrile atmosphere. Thank you for your comments this evening, Seb Gorka. We will continue to talk because talk is all we have. Tom, how do you react to what was said there?
Well, actually, I find myself agreeing with a lot of what he said. I mean, compared to George Galloway MP, for example, who was suggesting some kind of moral equivalence.
No limits. No limits for how many casualties in Gaza. No limits.
Yeah, but the point that Seb is making there is that this is not a conventional war that's going on across international borders. This is a prescribed terrorist organisation that committed the most barbarian acts, and Israel has a right to defend itself. That said, even wars have international rules, don't they? And Israel needs to allow this humanitarian effort to get into Gaza, and there is evidence that they've been preventing that.
I would say we're seeing barbarism all over. Another break, after which, and coming up, I will be joined by retired US Army Colonel, government official, author, consultant, political commentator, Colonel Douglas Macgregor, to ask if voters in the US and elsewhere have faith anymore in the election process. You're watching The Neil Oliver Show on GB News. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to The Neil Oliver Show. My next guest is Colonel Douglas Macgregor, retired US Army Colonel. We've spoken previously about many matters relating to Ukraine and a world at war in all but name. He issued his own State of the Union address earlier this week. Let's have a look.
Americans, I am Colonel Douglas Macgregor, combat veteran and former senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense under President Trump. As Chief Executive Officer of Our Country, Our Choice, I want to respectfully present an alternative view of the State of the Union. The Constitution, our nation's guiding light, mandates that the government promote the general welfare, a charge that obligates Washington to secure the basic necessities of life: energy, food, and shelter. Regrettably, the current administration is failing to perform these tasks.
Colonel Macgregor joins me now, I hope. Good to see you there, Colonel Macgregor.
Good to see you, Neil.
What inspired your own State of the Union address? Had you heard Biden's offering by the time you spoke?
I had read Biden's offering. I had not heard him deliver it. And once I read it, and also read what President Trump had submitted, I decided it was time for a different approach, because I don't think either of the presentations really touched on the things that are important to the American people.
Mr. Biden's headline statement was about continuing to fight Putin. How much further does that enterprise have to go?
Well, I don't think it's got very much further to go, Neil. We've run out of resources. It's prohibitively expensive for us. We're adding $1 trillion to our national sovereign debt every 100 days. We're at 34 trillion. That means within the next month or so, we'll be up to 35 trillion. It's unsustainable. And anyone who tells you that debt doesn't matter hasn't looked at the historical record. It very much matters. The other thing is that the American people are completely disinterested in this war. They're not interested in fighting anybody. They're much more concerned about our open borders, this massive invasion from the south, rising criminality in our cities, the lack of rule of law, which we were famous for hundreds of years. These are the things that they're concerned about. They want an end to the inflation. They want us to bring our financial house in order. So I don't think Biden, or for that matter, President Trump, really addressed those issues.
Colonel, I've spoken to various voices about the possibility that America is being invaded from the south. Brett Weinstein, Michael Yon. Do you see that as an accurate description? Is there some kind of undeclared invasion of the United States of America unfolding as we speak?
Yes, there is. It's very strange because when you dig down into the organizations and the associations that are actually promoting the massive influx of millions of people from largely the developing world and China, you discover that most of the money to support and sustain it is coming through non-governmental organizations that are funded by the United States and the United Nations. So it's absolutely preordained and orchestrated by those entities. Our government in the United States has been weaponized against us.
What are the American people saying? You know, we here on this side of the Atlantic, you know, we get precious little coverage of the scale of what's unfolding on the southern border. And we certainly we're not invited to get an impression of what the people, the electorate, those contemplating their vote in the upcoming elections, we don't hear those voices. What is the atmosphere in the States about this issue?
Well, today Americans are saying that every state is increasingly a border state because there's been a systematic effort to deposit hundreds of thousands of these so-called migrants, these illegal migrants, in all of the states. This is part of a plan to try and bring in people that can eventually be given citizenship and will vote for the status quo. That means the people in Washington are ruling us now, expect these people to support them in perpetuity. It's not working. Americans are furious because people at the state and local levels are running out of money. These people are being given free health care, free transportation, free shelter, free food, free everything, checks, thousands of dollars in cash. The New York City mayor is talking about giving everyone a $10,000 card of prepaid value. I mean, this is insane. Americans are fighting to put food on the table. They're trying to maintain their families. People are working 2 jobs, and these millions are walking in and being paid handsomely for their trouble. None of them are interested in becoming Americans. They don't know anything about that. They're here for everything that's free. And people know it, and they're angry. But to get to your critical point, the media doesn't really allow this to reach the body of the population. In other words, the discontent inside our country is not widely felt or understood because it doesn't reach the rest of the world, let alone our own government in Washington.
Tom Butte, it's almost surreal, I would say, to watch what's happening on the southern border. You know, on the one hand, no one denies that there are 10 million people perhaps have crossed, and that number may be higher. And yet there doesn't seem to be any active response by those agencies and by the government that might be able to intervene. It just seems to be, it's like watching some sort of slow motion remaking of the United States of America, of the Republic, before our eyes, with no one doing anything to counter it.
But it is surreal. You're right on that point, Neil. And it's also, I think, surreal the fact that tens of thousands of people risk their lives to come through the Darien Gap. And then there are often buses waiting for these migrants to bus them up to the American southern border. So the way I look at this, notwithstanding obviously the heated issue around irregular migration, which in my view is only ever going to be solved whether it's here in Europe and what's going on across the Channel or what's going on through the Darien Gap by international agreements on migration. I'll make that point. But secondly, I think what's really, really important is that we dial down, I think, some of the rhetoric here around the position that these migrants find themselves in. Why are they coming through the Darien Gap? What are they fleeing? Poverty, in some cases war and destitution. Yes, many of them are economic migrants for sure. But America was founded on this ideal. I mean, I've visited Ellis Island in New York Harbour, where 8 million migrants from Europe and elsewhere were processed within the space of just 12 months. So I think we've got to get this into some kind of historical perspective. But I do think also, Neil, there's a failure of statecraft here, because the answer to a lot of this irregular migration is around countries getting together. I mean, those South American countries, which I'm assuming the US has diplomatic relations to a lot of those South American countries, where is statecraft in all this?
How do you react, Colonel, to what my guest in the studio has to say there, Tom Buick? Where is the statecraft? And is he right to invoke a history, say, Ellis Island, America being, as we all know, a nation founded upon and founded by a migrant population? How do you react?
So Island did not found the United States. We existed from the early 1600s forward. Ellis Island was a temporary measure to deal with the influx of European immigrants that industry needed. We need to go back and understand that between 1815 and 1924, only 34 million Europeans came to the United States. Now look at that time span. If you go back over the last 30 years, we're talking about 50 to 60 million people arriving. It's impossible to assimilate, impossible to track, to understand. We actually built a public school system in the early part of this century in order to give education, but also to teach citizenship to millions of people who'd come in the years previous. It's a very different situation today. So these people, in many cases, are young men. We've had at least 20 to 30,000 young men from China showing up. There are actually camps in Darien exclusively for Chinese, exclusively for people from Latin America, exclusively for people from Africa. This is very well organized and orchestrated. None of these people are vetted. No one is asking anything about them. The objective is to push as many of them into our country as possible, to change us demographically, to denationalize us, to dilute our culture and our identity. That's what this is about. And this is not going to work. And it's almost impossible for me to imagine a future where there is not significant violence as a result of this, given our fragile financial position.
Colonel, it seems to me that the goal is wide open for a politician who would turn again to the working people of America and consider their aspirations, their needs, their wants, their anxieties. That there's a wave there that might be ridden to victory by anyone with the compassion to address what they want.
Well, that presupposes two things. First of all, something you brought up earlier about election integrity. We've had problems throughout our history from time to time with elections that were rigged or where there was substantial cheating, and we dealt with those things in the past. Today, it's very different. Today, we have the problem of automation and computers and online, a number of different voting methods that are very hard to track and control. This is by design, frankly. You've got people in Washington that want to stay there. They're in charge right now, particularly this Biden regime and the people in their cabinet. They are trying with all of their might to stay where they are. So it's very hard for us to deal with election integrity. We're trying. We've got people that are going to be out watching the polls, but that's a very difficult process. And I would argue that the other side has thousands and thousands of attorneys on the payroll of billionaires who are there to give an advantage to Biden and to the crowd that is currently governing us, not to the opposition. So that's part of the problem. The other thing is that if your democratic process is questionable, the notion that you can go out and hold a clean election and win it to the point where you can sweep in and take power is an illusion. And if you look at the money, the billionaire oligarchs are putting their money behind this invasion, behind the left, behind the people who are governing. This is an anti-American government by design. We know it, the American people know it, and they're bewildered as to how to fight back against it. So they will go to the polls, they will treat it seriously and try to make the best of a bad situation. But if this thing turns south, if it turns nasty, and they begin to conclude, accurately I suspect, that things have been rigged against them, I don't think that we're going to have peaceful, stable, easygoing times ahead of us. I think things will get very...
Hold that thought, please, Colonel. An anti-American government by design, so much more to talk about, but we're on another commercial break, after which, more important debate with Colonel McGregor and Tom Buick. What is the future for democracy in the West? You're watching The Neil Oliver Show on GB News. Don't go away. Welcome back to The Neil Oliver Show, where I am still with academic and commentator Tom Buick and US Colonel Douglas McGregor. Colonel, this war in Ukraine that goes on and on, is there something else? Is there some other reason for the preoccupation of this administration with that war? Is there something else that's yet to come to light for the general public to explain the determination to prosecute that war?
Yes, I think there is. But before I say anything, I just wanted to tell you to pass on my congratulations to George Galloway. I'm sure he'll be a breath of fresh air in Parliament. I think there are a number of forces at work right now inside Ukraine. We cultivated this war over decades. This is something that the globalist elites inside the United States, sometimes we call them neocons, whatever you like, were building in the hopes of ultimately goading the Russians into doing exactly what they did. You've already heard about the various biolabs that were established inside Ukraine, which were conducting very sinister operations that were directed at Russia. We now have public knowledge about the numbers of CIA stations inside Ukraine that were directing violence and hostility towards Russia. This obsession with Russia really begins, I think, at the point in time when it became clear that Russia was recovering. Once Mr. Putin took over, went after the oligarchs, was trying to bring order to chaos, I think at that point there was a decision that we can't allow this to happen. We don't want Russia to recover as a great power. And you have a number of people with financial interests, people that were trying to find a way to destroy the Russian government, strip Russia of its resources, exploit its weakness, and render Russia essentially a poor satellite of the United States and NATO. All of that, of course, has failed miserably. And in the process, they were billing all of this as a way to hold NATO together. Remember, ever since 1992, NATO has been looking for a reason to exist. It was very clear when I reached NATO in the late 1990s that in the absence of the Soviet Union, there was no real justification for the old alliance. So they had to find reasons, and those reasons started in the Balkans with a series of interventions there. And then there was the slogan, NATO is either out of area or out of business. In other words, it has to march into other people's countries around the world, shoulder to shoulder with us, or it has no purpose. You have to wrap all of these things together and then look at the activities of people like Larry Fink, who's the chairman of BlackRock, and the billions of dollars that are about to be spent to buy up vast tracts of Ukrainian farmland that can then be repurposed and exploited by Fink and his friends and the agricultural conglomerates in the United States. There's a lot going on, and this happens whenever you see a country utterly and completely destroyed. And that is the case with Ukraine. Ukraine as a nation is destroyed.
Tom, when you listen to the Colonel, and you said earlier that that war started when Putin sent military across the border. When you listen to the Colonel, what do you think? Isn't it the case that it's a much more complicated story and that NATO and the West were the provocateurs there?
Wars are always very complicated. You go back through history. We made a decision in this country in 1939 when Churchill became Prime Minister, the head of a national government, not to accept appeasement. I mean, as Churchill said at the time, you cannot compromise with a tiger when your head is between his jaws. Where I agree with the Colonel is that obviously there is a degree of complicity here of the West more generally, but certainly in terms of the US and UK, when we think about the fact that Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in the dying embers of the old Soviet Union, that the West, the UK was a signatory, and Russia guaranteed Ukraine's sovereign borders. In 2014, when Putin sent troops into Crimea, annexed Crimea, what did countries like Germany, the Netherlands and France do? They signed the Nord Stream 2 deal with him to get cheap energy into Europe. So I agree with the Colonel in terms of the complicity, but the issue right now, and back to the Churchillian statement, is you cannot appease a dictator. Putin is a dictator, and that's why he needs to be repelled.
Colonel, while I still have you, I listened to your State of the Union address, and unlike the sitting president, I thought that you identified and sought to address profound problems that the Republic faces. Given the opportunity, would you throw your hat in the ring? Would you take up a political role to directly affect the destiny of your country?
Well, frankly, that's an impossibility. You have to understand the structure of power in the United States and the distribution of wealth, and that's simply an impossibility. It's not something one does a few months ahead of an election in this country. And the parties are absolutely united in that they do not want fundamental change that will disrupt the flow of cash to their various donors and friends and supporters. We refer to Washington, D.C. as donor-occupied. In other words, the billionaire oligarchs in the United States control Washington. There is no real democracy in the United States. That's what most people are discovering. Democracy is a sham. We used to have representative government where the people in Washington actually were accountable to the people that elected. They aren't anymore.
I have to jump in there, Colonel. I can only say that I, for one, would like to see you having much more of a direct influence over the destiny of the land of the free. But thank you so much for joining us so far, and we will speak again. That's it for the Neil Oliver Show, but we'll be back next week. Dr. Claire Craig will be among my guests, speaking about harms to children during lockdown, and I'll look forward to seeing you then. Thanks to Tom, thanks to all my guests.